Hey guys, Waterfowler41 here, and in today's video we are going to be installing a 1-inch spring spacer on the rear of my truck. So right now, just from a suspension standpoint, I have Bilstein 5100s in the front, and then I have the factory Bilstein 4600s in the rear. I have the front Bilstein 5100s set at Circlip 5, which on the Rebel or trucks with off-road package should be about 2 inches of lift in the front. I've not done anything to the rear yet. So the reason why I want to install a 1-inch spacer in the rear is because sometimes when you have this truck parked on flat land, because of the way the body and everything curves on the Rebel itself, it kind of looks nose high. So this is kind of an experiment here. And really what I want to do is install these 1-inch spacers in the rear and just see what that does to the overall look of the truck. Does it restore some of the rake? Right now I have roughly a 1/2 inch of rake to the front. So theoretically, after I install these spacers, I should have 1.5 inches to the front. So I'll have 1.5 inches of the rake. So the back's going to be up a little bit. I don't know what the factory rake was, nor do I know if 1.5 inches of rake is going to be too obnoxious. We're going to find out. But installing spacers is pretty simple. So I picked up these Motofab DR1R. So these are the Dodge Ram spacers. So these are pretty much universal fit across all the Dodge platforms and Ram platforms. These are the 1-inch kits. So unlike the front, in the rear, the size of the spacer pretty much dictates the lift. So this is approximately 1 inch. Let's see here. 1 inch from the top of the spacer to the bottom. Yep, set. So 1 inch. And these guys get installed on the truck underneath the factory springs. So on the Rams, you have rear coil springs, unlike a GM or a Ford where you're going to have a leaf spring and you're going to use a block. Whereas with these, you're going to use a spacer. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to get your truck up on a jack stand on the frame, and then you're going to put your car jack underneath your axle, and you're going to undo the strut or the shock, the sway bar, and we're going to undo the sway bar on the other side just to make life easier for us. And theoretically what that should do is allow us to move this side of the axle down, so it frees up the spring. And honestly, where it's at right now, the spring is kind of loose, so it should be pretty easy to free up enough room to pop that spring out and pop this guy up underneath it, and then put the spring back in, and then go over and do it on the other side. So from a tool standpoint, you're going to need a 21 millimeter wrench, a 18 millimeter wrench, 21 millimeter socket, and either an impact gun or a ratchet, and that should be all you need to get your hands dirty on the truck here. So like I said, I didn't waste any time. I already got the truck up on jack stands on the passenger side. And then I have my hydraulic jack up underneath the axle, and it's sort of pushing the axle up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to undo this 21 millimeter bolt on the rear shock at the bottom. That should let that shock swing out. And then I'm going to undo both sides of the sway bar here. And what that'll allow me to do is get a little bit more flexibility with the axle. Then once that is done, I might also... we'll see. We may have to undo this little bracket here just to make sure that this doesn't get hung up on anything, the brake cable there. But once you undo the shock and you undo the sway bar, you should have the ability to then drop the axle just a little bit, so then this spring frees up and you could take your spacer and just slip it up underneath there. So the other thing I'm going to do is, and I don't know if this is really that necessary, I'm just going to draw an indexing mark just so we know that the spring is going back in the way it came out, with the exception of the spacer underneath it. So let me go ahead and take this sway bar off here, undo that bottom shock, and we'll figure out if having one side of the truck up at a time, because the other side's on a wheel still, we're going to figure out if you can do this one side at a time. All right, one thing that you should always do before you do any sort of suspension work on your truck is take before and after measurements. So what I did to make this helpful is I put a piece of blue painter's tape, and then I put a black dot where I took my measurements from. That way I know for sure that my before and after measurements are from the exact same point. So if we take a look at the fronts versus the rears, so right now my front end, the driver's side, sitting at about 39 3/4, and the passenger side's 40 1/4. This is pretty typical to have that kind of lean on your truck for two reasons. One, gas tank's sitting on the driver's side, and two, roads are crowned. So when you drive on a road, if your truck was completely level, you'd basically be driving on an angle. So if they lower the driver's side, you're driving almost flat on most roads. So back to my measurements, 39 3/4 and 40 1/4 in the front. And remember, that's with a 2-inch lift. And then the rears right now are sitting at 40 1/4 and 40 1/2. So at the end of this, I should see 41 1/4, 41 1/2, and probably no impact to these guys, although sometimes when I overthink it, I think when you teeter-totter a truck and lift the back up a little bit more, maybe the front goes down a little bit, so that's why I took the measurements, just in case we could confirm it. So I have the sway bar loosened up on both sides. Word of warning, do this when the truck is on the ground. It's a lot easier. When it's up in the air, I had to jack the axle back up to make it level, to undo the end link here, because if you do it when the truck is sitting unlevel, you're putting a lot of stress on that sway bar because it's doing what it should be doing, and it'll be kind of a pain in the butt to get the end link out of there. So do it when the truck's on the ground. It's a lot easier. It's not going to spring out of there. But once you do that, then you should be able to move your sway bar down. So my sway bar is free from everything. Then the next thing I'm going to do is 21mm socket, 21mm wrench on this side, and I'm going to take this bolt off of the factory shock here. From that point, once I remove this bolt, this side of the axle will be able to drop down because the shock is not going to be holding it in place. Now you do have upper and lower rear control arms that are going to hold things in place. I have aftermarket ones, but even if you're doing this on a factory truck, you do have factory upper and lower control arms that are going to keep your axle in place. So you don't need to worry about it going front and back like you do when you undo a leaf spring. And you also have a track bar, and we're not going to touch the track bar. I've seen people who had to undo the track bar to make it fit. I don't think I'll have to. I think I'll get enough play in this, and the 1-inch lift is really not crazy. Let's get that shock removed, or at least the bottom of it. We'll swing the front of it this way, and then we should be able to slowly lower the jack and free up the spring here, pop our spacer in there, and then reverse everything. All right, so we have that bottom bolt removed. Now that strut is just sitting in that little pocket right there, so the axle can move freely now on this side of the truck, so on the passenger side. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look around and make sure we know where all of the hoses and cables are. That way when we're lowering everything on this side of the truck, we are mindful of what to watch for so we don't overextend anything or pop any of the hoses or anything like that. So I have the hydraulic floor jack there, and I'm going to slowly lower that, and every so often come over here and check the spring until I have enough play on it to get it out of there. And then from there, we'll just pop our spacer up in there and get everything back into place. All right, so our spring is out. Axles dropped pretty low on that side, so I did end up having to undo this little bracket right here that goes onto there, and then there is this ABS wire that's zip tied to the frame. I pulled that little bracket out of there. So good thing I did put those markings on my spring, because there are two little knobs at the top of the spring that need to land back in the home up inside the spring housing. So now all we're gonna do is take our spacer, and our spacer just goes right like that, and then we just throw everything back in the truck. So let's go ahead and figure out how to get everything aligned here and get it back in the truck, and then we'll start on the other side. All right, so the spacer's in. Pretty simple job. And again, there are those two little knobs inside the rubber insulator that goes on top of the spring, so make sure those land back in their hole. Make sure you put a mark on the outside of the spring. That helps align the spring because the spring only goes into that cup one orientation. So now we're going to reverse everything. So I'm going to go ahead and jack up the axle until my shock lines up with the shock mount on the axle, and then put that bolt in there, and then from there we'll hop on over to the other side and do that one. I'm a little winded because this guy does take some muscle to get back over the spacer there, so you can see my spacer's right down here. But once you get it on top of the spacer cup, you're good to go. So let me jack up this guy until I could line up. So I got a considerable way to go in order for him to line up with this little shock mount down here, but then I could hop over to the other side. All right, so we are on the driver's side, and everything is the same with the exception of this little bracket. So on the passenger side, it was pretty accessible. You didn't have to go up behind the rear wheel liner, but with this one, you had to reach up in the wheel liner to undo it. So now that I have the brake cable and everything undone, I have the axle basically being supported by my jack there. I'm gonna go ahead and loosen up the bottom shock bolt, and then from there we'll be able to drop everything down, pull the spring out, put the spacer in, and then reverse everything. All right, so the passenger side is done. So let's do one real quick walkthrough of everything. First thing you need to do is make sure you jack up the truck from the frame. You need to be able to move that axle independent from the rest of the truck. Then the next thing you need to do is use a marker and mark the outside of your spring. That way you know what orientation that spring came out of the vehicle, so you can push it back into the vehicle the same way, because you want the spring to have to be aligned with how it came out. Then you want to remove the sway bar end links on both sides. So just undo the end link to sway bar point. That's an 8mm and an 18mm nut. Then 21mm socket and 21mm wrench to undo the bottom shock bolt. Then you're going to want to use a jack to jack up the axle, push it up high enough that you could loosen up and get that bolt out from the shock. Then you slowly want to lower the rear axle so you could start to free up that spring and pull this guy out and slip the spacer in there. Now, one thing you might need to do is pay attention to these brake lines. There's a 12mm bolt on both sides holding a bracket that you might need to undo so it frees up some slack in this line so you can go down as low as you can. On the passenger side, it didn't need to go that low. On the driver's side, I really needed to get as much travel out of the axle as I could get, so I had to go up and undo that mount. Now when you put everything back together, everything when it's in the air, just tighten up everything as tight as you can get it. So reversing everything, so put the spacer in, line the spring up, put the shock in, jack up the axle until the shock lines up with the bottom shock mount, slide that bolt through, tighten it. Then we're going to go ahead and get this truck off of the jack stands, put the wheel back on. We are going to reinstall the sway bar when the truck is on the ground. I'm going to drive it back and forth a little bit just to make sure everything's freed up, and then I'm going to go in and torque everything down. So the bottom shock mount is 145 foot-pounds, and the sway bar end links on both sides are going to be 35 foot-pounds. You should not have undone any other bolts in this process. I left my control arms bolted down and I left my panhard bar. I know I've seen people loosen those up. I didn't need to loosen them up for everything to fit in here. I'm sure that would have bought me some extra room, but I didn't want to dick around with the panhard bar being loose and then my differential sliding back and forth. So 145 foot-pounds, 35 foot-pounds, and now the magical question, do you need an alignment? I don't think it will hurt. I have lifetime alignments at Firestone, and I didn't get an alignment after I installed the 5100, so I think this weekend I'm going to make an appointment to head in there and have them align my truck. But theoretically, when you're doing anything to just the rear, you're really not messing with any of the alignment. However, since you are picking up the front of the truck, you might be changing some of the angles on your front wheels, and it doesn't hurt to at least go in and have it checked. So let me get everything put back together. Let me drive it around a little bit, come back, and we can take final measurements and see how much did I actually gain. I'm hoping I gained just shy of an inch, but based on how the other side's sitting right now, I bet you I gained a full inch on everything, and it looks good. All right, we are good to go. So if you could tell, truck's got a significant amount of rake now. Pretty much looks like the factory rake, but the truck is just a little bit higher than factory, being that I'm on 34.5, plus I got 2 inches in the front, 1 inch in the rear. So the truck is slightly lifted. I could still get in and out of my garage, and I love the way the truck looks. The truck rides perfectly fine. So let's talk about final measurements. Pretty interesting. So the fronts stayed the same. So like I suspected, they were staying the same. The rears gained 1.25 inches. So I'm going to give this some time and then I'm going to come back and measure everything. But basically adding that 1 inch spacer on the rear of my truck gave me 1.25 inches. Now, one thing I will say is when I was working on my truck, I was pointed towards my house, and now I'm backed in my driveway, or backed in my garage. So maybe that's playing into it. But I did absolutely gain some lift in the rear of the truck. It is noticeable. I do like it, so it's kind of giving that more aggressive look. And when I did the 5100s, I wasn't doing that with the intent to keep in the truck level. I don't like a level truck. I like a truck with a little bit of rake. I think these Rebels look awesome with rake. And like I said, when you have 2 inches on the front with the Bilsteins or whatever lift kit you do, and you don't do anything to the rear of these trucks, when they're parked on flat ground, sometimes with the way the wheel wells and everything are curved, the truck looks kind of nose high. And to me, I hate that. I don't want to look like a squatting truck. So added a 1 inch spacer to the rear is completely manageable project. I knocked it out in probably 50 minutes by myself. So if you have a helper, probably knock it out in half the time. That is how you install the Motofab, or really any sort of 1 inch rear spring spacer on the trucks. 2 inches would have been a fight. So I would imagine you need a little bit more hardware to jam two more inches in here. But now keep in mind, these are the off-road package springs, so my springs are 1 inch longer than the factory normal springs. So if you do not have a Rebel or do not have a Ram with the ORP package, you could probably do a 2 inch in the back, and it'll give you the same results as my truck, and it will be easy to do. But 2 inches with the Rebel 1 inch springs in here would have been a pain in the butt. But anyway, that is how you install the Motofab 1 inch rear spacers on the truck. But with that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care.